The man appeared just after sunrise at 6:41 a.m., when the thin mountain air above Mullis Pass still carried the sharp cold of night. A ranger later described the moment as so quiet it felt staged, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The figure emerged from the tree line without sound, stepping onto the gravel access road that led toward the Mullis Pass Ranger Station in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado. At first, Ranger Daniel Crow thought it was an animal. The man's posture was wrong, too hunched, too stiff. His movements were hesitant, unsteady, as if each step required negotiation with his own body. He was barefoot, his feet were darkened and cracked, the skin split in places, leaving thin lines of dried blood that had long since stopped bleeding. Draped over his shoulders was what appeared to be an irregularly stitched garment made from animal hide, likely deer or elk, tanned crudely and tied together with strips of sinew. Arizona State Route 88, known locally as the Apache Trail, had long carried a reputation that went beyond traffic accidents and missing hikers. Long before asphalt cut through the rock, the Superstition Mountains were spoken of in warnings, not directions. Apache legends described the range as a place where greedy men vanished in pursuit of cursed gold, where spirits guarded the land by confusing the minds of intruders. Locals said the mountain did not kill, it changed people. At 2:07 a.m. on October 31st, that reputation resurfaced. Thomas Hale, a long-haul truck driver with 23 years on the road, was navigating a narrow bend just east of Canyon Lake. The night was moonless. Wind slid down the cliffs in dry, rasping breaths, carrying dust across the highway in pale veils that caught briefly in his headlights before disappearing again. There were no buildings, no lights, no cell signal, only road, rock, and darkness. Then something moved. When the figure came closer, Crow realized it was a human being. The man's face was skeletal, hollowed by extreme weight loss. His beard was long and matted, tangled with bits of plant matter and dirt, reaching nearly to his chest. His hair, once brown according to later records, was now streaked with gray and hung in uneven clumps around his face. His eyes, however, were what unsettled Crow most. They were open and alert, yet distant, scanning the surroundings not with curiosity but with what appeared to be reflexive caution. Like an animal that had learned the cost of being seen. Crow approached slowly, keeping his voice calm, measured, the way rangers are trained to speak to injured hikers or disoriented survivors. The man did not respond. When Crow was within a few feet, the figure collapsed. Medical personnel Ellen Price, a trauma surgeon with decades of experience, focused on the hands. As saline washed away layers of embedded sand, it became clear the wounds extended beyond surface trauma. In 2020, a Colorado court had formally issued death certificates. Now one of them was lying on the ground, breathing. By the time Evan Holt was transported to Mercy Regional Medical Center in Durango, word of his identity had already begun to spread through internal channels. Hospital staff noted his refusal to maintain eye contact, his violent flinching at sudden sounds, and his repeated attempts to pull away when doors closed. When asked where he had been, he did not answer. When asked how long, he showed no recognition of the question. He did not ask about Caleb. For the first 48 hours, Evan spoke only once more. In a low, strained voice, he asked if the walls were stone. The response was immediate and cautious. Law enforcement officials contacted the San Juan County Sheriff's Office, which in turn notified federal authorities due to the circumstances of the original disappearance. The case, long archived and digitally sealed, was reopened. Evan Holt's family was notified that same afternoon. Small stones had been driven into tissue. Calluses had formed over partially healed cuts, only to be torn open again. The damage suggested repeated abrasion against rock, bare hands used as tools. Quietly, Dr. Price noted the same conclusion forming in the minds of her colleagues. These injuries were intentional. The woman identified herself as Mary Wilson, age 32. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from acute psychological distress. Toxicology found no drugs, no alcohol, no signs of recent sedation. She was lucid. When asked about family, she hesitated. Her gaze flicked to the corner of the room, tracking something unseen. Her breathing grew shallow. After several seconds, she whispered a single question. "Where is Sandra?" The name meant nothing to hospital staff at the time. By sunrise, news of the discovery reached the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Detective Lance Carter reviewed the preliminary report in silence. A woman found wandering Route 88. His father, Thomas Holt, received the call while standing in his kitchen in Fort Collins. He would later say that the voice on the other end of the line sounded wrong, not emotional, not excited, but restrained, as if the caller was afraid to speak too loudly, afraid that the reality of what they were saying might collapse under its own weight. His son was alive. By evening, a controlled media blackout had been requested. The sheriff's office cited concerns for the survivor's mental and physical health, but information leaked anyway, as it always does. By nightfall, online forums were already reviving old threads. Photographs from 2018 resurfaced, two men smiling beneath alpine skies, backpacks loaded, confident, capable. How could someone survive 6 years in terrain where experienced climbers routinely died in days? Doctors treating Evan were careful with their language. They described his condition as consistent with prolonged captivity or extreme isolation. Severe hand trauma inconsistent with environmental injury alone. Psychological symptoms bordering on post-traumatic shock. No missing persons report matching her description in the past month. But the location mattered. Carter knew the Superstition Mountains well. He had worked 2 missing hiker cases there in the past decade. Neither had been resolved. Later that morning, officers contacted the Wilson family. Mary Wilson's parents arrived at the hospital shortly after noon. Surveillance cameras recorded their arrival, an aging couple walking too quickly, faces tight with disbelief. They had spoken to their daughters 2 weeks earlier. Mary had mentioned a hiking trip, a chance to reconnect. With Sandra, family members would later describe Sandra Wilson as the opposite of her sister. Where Mary was disciplined and controlled, Sandra drifted. Where Mary built a successful startup, Sandra accumulated debt. Their relationship had always been complicated, bound by blood, strained by comparison. They avoided speculation beyond what the body showed. Healed fractures, scar tissue from repeated burns, and strange patterned markings across his chest and upper arms that were neither accidental nor medically administered. When asked about the animal hide, Evan shook his head and turned away. Investigators, meanwhile, returned to the case file. They reviewed maps, GPS logs, radio transcripts from the 2018 search. Nothing in the original investigation suggested foul play. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no equipment. The mountains had simply taken 2 men and given nothing back, until now. As night settled over the San Juan range, the same peaks that had stood silent for 6 years loomed outside the hospital windows. Somewhere within them lay the space between what could be proven and what could only be claimed. Evan Holt had come back from that space. But whether he had returned with the truth or with a story shaped by unimaginable trauma was a question no one was yet prepared to answer. Hospital staff observed something curious during the reunion. Mary did not cry when she saw her parents. She allowed them to hold her but remained rigid, eyes open, body tense. When her mother spoke Sandra's name, Mary's jaw tightened. Her fingers curled involuntarily, reopening small cracks along healing wounds. Detective Carter conducted his first brief interview that evening. Mary recounted a story of abduction, a man in reflective sunglasses, a coin toss, a fall into darkness. She spoke clearly, emotionally, yet without hesitation, as if rehearsed. She described captivity in a cave, chains around her ankles, survival through sheer will. She explained her hands as the result of clawing through rock to escape. Carter listened without interruption. He had learned long ago that truth often revealed itself not in what was said, but in what was too smooth. Search teams were dispatched to the superstition range within 48 hours. Evan Holt and Caleb Rourke were not strangers to isolation, nor were they inexperienced wanderers seduced by the romance of wilderness. By the time they applied for their backcountry permit in late August of 2018, both men had spent years moving deliberately through environments that demanded patience, preparation, and respect. Their familiarity with risk was not theoretical. It was documented, logged, and often archived in footage, field notes, and environmental reports. Evan was 31 years old at the time, a documentary filmmaker whose work focused on vanishing ecosystems and the fragile boundary between human activity and untouched land. He was known among colleagues for his restraint behind the camera. He favored long, static shots. He avoided narration whenever possible, letting wind, water, and silence speak instead. Friends described him as methodical, introverted, and quietly obsessive about detail. He was not impulsive. A cave matching Mary's description was located in LaBarge Canyon. Inside, investigators found a sleeping bag neatly rolled, expensive organic food packaging, bottled water arranged in rows bar. His was not a place of desperation. Receipts recovered nearby showed purchases made 2 days before the disappearance. The name on the receipt, Sandra Wilson. As the investigation deepened, forensic analysts compared dental records. Ari Wilson's file showed a titanium post in her lower molar from a prior root canal. Woman in the hospital had no such implant. And confronted with this discrepancy, the woman calling herself Mary did not deny it, Burr. He smiled. By the time deputies arrived at the Wilson family home in Paradise Valley, Sandra Wilson was waiting, calm, composed, almost relieved, Burr. And handcuffed, she offered no resistance, ate her during interrogation. She would describe the past 3 weeks as the most complete I have ever felt. He had not wanted to be near Mary Burr. He had wanted to be Mary. He planned meticulously, sometimes to the point of irritation for those around him. Caleb Rourke, 34, complimented Evan in ways that felt almost engineered. An environmental scientist specializing in alpine watershed systems, Caleb had worked seasonal contracts for state and federal agencies across Colorado and Utah. He was physically larger than Evan, broad-shouldered and steady, but his temperament was gentle. He carried laminated maps even when GPS data was available, trusted handwritten notes more than digital logs, and had a habit of double-checking equipment at the end of each day even when exhausted. They met a decade earlier at a university field program and remained close long after graduation. Their friendship was built less on constant communication than on shared understanding. Months could pass without contact, and then one message, usually a photograph of a ridgeline or an unusual rock formation, would restart the connection instantly. The 2018 expedition was Evan's idea, but it was not sudden. And the Superstition Mountains, silent and ancient, had given her the stage. Arizona had always belonged to Mary Wilson. From the outside, her life followed a trajectory that appeared deliberate, almost inevitable. A top-tier education, a disciplined routine, a technology startup that grew quietly but steadily, avoiding spectacle while accumulating respect. She was described by colleagues as controlled, by investors as reliable, by her parents as the one who made it. Sandra Wilson lived in the margins of that gravity. Younger by 19 months, she spent most of her life orbiting Mary's accomplishments like a shadow that never quite aligned. Jobs were temporary. Relationships ended abruptly. Financial trouble followed her like a low-grade fever, never fatal but never gone. Where Mary planned years ahead, Sandra survived weeks at a time. To the outside world, they were sisters who had simply grown apart. Inside Sandra's mind, the separation felt more like theft. For nearly a year, He had been researching underdocumented regions of the San Juan Mountains, particularly the eastern edge of the Uncompahgre wilderness. While the area was mapped and regulated, certain high-altitude basins and narrow sub-valleys had received little focused ecological study due to their inaccessibility. Evan proposed a dual-purpose journey. Caleb would conduct informal environmental observations, while Evan filmed the terrain as part of a larger documentary project examining how climate shifts were altering water sources in alpine zones. Their permit application reflected this precision. Filed with the U.S. Forest Service, it detailed a 10-day route beginning near Molas Pass, looping southeast through a series of unnamed basins, and exiting near Engineer Mountain. The itinerary included conservative daily mileage, multiple contingency camps, and scheduled satellite check-ins. Rangers reviewing the application later confirmed there were no red flags. From childhood, Sandra learned to study Mary the way one studies a language they are not allowed to speak. The cadence of her voice when she explained something complicated. The way she listened, head slightly tilted, eyes steady, never interrupting. The precise slant of her handwriting, confident without being aggressive. Mary did not flaunt her success. That made it worse. In Sandra's private journals, later recovered by investigators, the language was consistent. Mary did not earn her life. She occupied it. She stood in a place that should have belonged to both of them, or, more accurately, to Sandra alone. By the time Sandra was 28, imitation had evolved into rehearsal. She began spending hours alone in her apartment bathroom, standing before the mirror with the door locked. At first, the exercises were subtle. She repeated Mary's name aloud, adjusting pitch and breath until the sound felt less foreign in her mouth. She recorded herself on her phone, played it back, deleted it, tried again. Too soft. The equipment list exceeded minimum requirements. They carried a satellite phone, a personal locator beacon, paper maps, compasses, water purification systems, and provisions for 12 days instead of 10. Evan had insisted on redundancy. Caleb had insisted on weight balance. On September 9, 2018, they checked in at the Molas Pass trailhead just after 7 a.m. A ranger on duty, Maria Linton, logged their names and noted their calm demeanor. She would later recall that neither man appeared rushed. They asked about recent weather shifts and wildlife movement. Caleb inquired specifically about water flow near the eastern drainage zones. Evan took photographs of the trailhead signage, a habit he had developed for continuity shots in his films. The weather forecast was favorable. Clear skies, mild daytime temperatures. No major storm systems predicted for at least a week. Their first 3 days followed the plan closely. Too sharp. Not enough restraint. Mary never rushed her words. She allowed silence to sit. Sandra practiced that too. She studied old voicemail messages, looping short clips until she could anticipate the pauses. She watched video interviews Mary had given about her company, muting the sound first, mimicking the posture, the stillness. Only later would she add the voice back in. Walking came next. Sandra realized early that people recognized, others less by facial features than by movement. Mary walked with economy. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Sandra practiced pacing the length of her apartment hallway, correcting her shoulders, adjusting stride length by inches. When she stumbled, she corrected herself. When frustration rose, she swallowed it. Progress required discipline. Handwriting proved the most difficult. Mary's signature appeared on legal documents, investor contracts, and corporation forms. It was elegant and deceptively simple. Sandra bought the same brand of pen Mary used. GPS data retrieved later from Evan's camera equipment confirmed steady progress along the intended route. Camps were established within projected zones. Elevation gains were consistent with expectations. On the evening of September 11th, Evan recorded a short video log. He spoke briefly about the silence, the clarity of the air, the way sound seemed to disappear once the sun dipped behind the peaks. On the morning of September 12th, Evan sent a message through the satellite phone to his father, all good. Terrain's rougher than expected, but manageable. Caleb's found some interesting runoff patterns. We might push east a bit more before turning back. Don't worry if we go quiet for a day. The message was time-stamped at 8:16 a.m. Investigators would later note that nothing in the message suggested distress. No urgency, no coded language, no deviation from Evan's typical communication style. If anything, it reflected enthusiasm. That was the last confirmed contact. What followed, according to reconstructed data, was subtle. She filled notebooks with attempts, copying the letters over and over, tracing scanned documents beneath thin sheets of paper until muscle memory replaced intention. By the end of that summer, she could sign Mary Wilson without thinking. The idea of the hike emerged not as impulse, but as conclusion. Sandra suggested the Superstition Mountains because she understood the psychology of disappearance. People vanished there with disturbing regularity. The terrain was hostile, the legends persistent. If something went wrong, the mountain itself would shoulder the blame. Mary hesitated at first. Work obligations, investor calls. But Sandra framed the trip carefully. A reset, a chance to reconnect. No expectations. Mary agreed. On October 14th, surveillance footage captured their white Jeep Compass pulling into the Lost Dutchman State Park parking lot shortly after dawn. A retired couple later reported seeing the sisters argue quietly near the trailhead. Nothing loud. Their route shifted slightly eastward, consistent with Evan's stated intention to explore less documented side valleys. The change was not dramatic. It did not cross into restricted zones. It did not trigger any automated alerts. It was the kind of adjustment experienced backcountry travelers make routinely. And then, the signals stopped. When Evan and Caleb failed to check in on September 14th, it did not immediately raise alarms. Satellite communication gaps were common in that terrain. But when September 16 passed with no exit confirmation, concern began to spread. By the morning of September 17th, Thomas Holt contacted the San Juan County Sheriff's Office. By then, the mountains had already begun to erase whatever trace the two men had left behind. From the outside, everything about the expedition suggested control, competence, and intention. There were no impulsive decisions documented, no arguments reported, no financial or personal stressors that might explain a voluntary disappearance. Nothing physical. Just tension, compressed and controlled. The mountain absorbed them easily. What happened next would never be fully reconstructed. No witnesses, no recording, no body. But evidence suggested Mary never left the mountain alive. In the days that followed, Sandra transformed preparation into performance. The cave she selected was not hidden by accident. It was accessible enough to allow resupply, remote enough to discourage casual discovery. She stocked it carefully. Organic food, bottled water, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights. Everything chosen to suggest survival without appearing comfortable. Pain, however, could not be staged cheaply. Sandra understood that credibility required suffering, real suffering, the kind that left marks beyond doubt. She began with abrasion, pressing her palms against stone until skin split, waiting for swelling to subside before repeating the process. Each session was controlled, measured. Evan and Caleb had entered the San Juan Mountains, as they always did, prepared, aware, and confident in their ability to return. That was what made their disappearance so deeply unsettling. They did everything right. The final signal did not arrive with drama. There was no panic in Evan Holt's voice, no sudden interruption mid-sentence, no sound of wind rushing or rocks breaking loose. Instead, it was the absence that followed, quiet, unremarkable, and therefore easy to dismiss, that would later haunt everyone involved. At 6:12 p.m. on September 12, 2018, Evan activated his camera for what would become the last recorded footage recovered from the expedition. The clip was just under 2 minutes long. It showed a wide, static shot of a narrow basin framed by steep rock walls, their upper ridges already darkening as the sun slipped westward. A thin stream cut through the center of the valley, its surface reflecting the fading light in brief flashes of silver. She documented the progression mentally, ensuring the damage appeared chaotic without being disabling. When skin toughened into callus, she tore it open again. Fingernails were next. Using a flat rock, she levered beneath the nail beds, stopping only when pain threatened loss of consciousness. Blood soaked into sand, dried, was scrubbed away, then reapplied with fresh injury. She did not scream. Sound wasted energy. In her mind, this was not self-harm, it was shedding. Each wound removed a piece of Sandra that no longer served a purpose. What remained was closer to Mary, cleaner, quieter, more believable. At night, she rehearsed the story she would tell. A man in mirrored sunglasses, a coin toss, a scream swallowed by the canyon. She refined details until they felt inevitable. The lies nested within truth, superstition mountains, real caves, real fear. She timed her emergence carefully. 3 weeks was long enough to convince, short enough to survive. When she stepped onto Route 88, she did not feel relief. She felt completion. Caleb's voice could be heard off-camera, calm and analytical, commenting on the unusual mineral deposits along the streambed. Evan did not respond verbally. He adjusted the focus, tightened the frame, and let the sound of water dominate the audio. There was no visible tension between them, no sign of urgency. The footage ended naturally, the way thousands of Evans clips had before, with the quiet click of the camera powering down. Metadata confirmed the location matched the eastern edge of their projected route, roughly 2 miles beyond the point where they had originally planned to turn back west. The deviation was modest, well within the margin of exploration they had built into their schedule. It was not reckless, it was curious. That evening, according to later reconstruction, they established camp in the basin. No further recordings were made. No additional messages were sent. The satellite phone remained powered off, as it often was to conserve battery. At Mountain Vista Medical Center, staff noted her composure between episodes of panic. She cried at appropriate moments. She trembled when expected. Her fear aligned neatly with her narrative. Only Detective Carter sensed the dissonance. He noticed the absence of confusion common in trauma victims. Her memories were sequential, clean, painful but not fragmented. She spoke as someone recounting something learned, not relived. Forensic evidence deepened the unease. Receipts, dental records, fingerprints beneath duct tape used in the cave, Sandra's prints, pressed deliberately, not smeared. The final confrontation did not come with hysteria. When Carter explained the dental discrepancy, Sandra listened politely. When he placed the Walmart footage on the table, she leaned forward, interested. When he used her name, not Mary's, she did not correct him. Arrest footage showed Sandra smiling faintly as cuffs closed around her wrists. The following morning, September 13th, passed without incident, at least in any way that could be documented. There were no outgoing signals, no emergency activations, no GPS pings. For experienced backcountry travelers, a day of silence was not unusual. Rangers would later emphasize this point repeatedly. Silence by itself meant nothing. On September 14th, the scheduled check-in window opened and closed without contact. Thomas Holt noticed the gap that afternoon. He considered calling immediately, then stopped himself. Evan had warned him there might be periods of radio silence. Over the years, Thomas had learned not to project fear where none was warranted. He waited. So did everyone else. By September 15th, unease began to replace patience. Evan and Caleb had not exited any trailheads. No new GPS data appeared. The satellite phone remained dormant. That night, Thomas sent a brief message asking for confirmation. It was delivered. It was not answered. Later, alone in an interrogation room, she offered her only unsolicited statement. "I didn't want her things," she said calmly. "I wanted her place." In court, experts described Sandra's psychology using clinical language: identity disturbance, obsessive fixation, pathological envy. None of it fully captured the intent. Sandra had not wanted to destroy Mary. She wanted to consume her. In her prison cell, months later, guards reported hearing conversations when no one else was present. 2 voices, similar but distinct. One calm, one sharp. Sandra was often found standing before the small steel mirror, practicing expressions, adjusting posture, perfecting a smile. 3 days after the woman identifying herself as Mary Wilson was stabilized, Detective Lance Carter began the first formal interview. It took place in a small, windowless room on the 3rd floor of Mountain Vista Medical Center. The walls were beige, chosen for neutrality. A recorder sat centered on the table, its red light steady and indifferent. In hindsight, investigators would describe this period as the most critical window, when something had likely already gone wrong, but before any formal response was triggered. In the wilderness, time is elastic. Hours stretch into days. Days collapse into moments of irreversible consequence. When the official report of overdue hikers was filed on the morning of September 17th, nearly 5 days had passed since the last confirmed activity. Search and rescue operations began immediately, but what they encountered only deepened the mystery. Rangers located the basin shown in Evans' final footage by cross-referencing topographical features visible in the video. The terrain matched precisely. The stream was there. The rock formations were unmistakable. But the camp was gone. There were no tents, no sleeping bags, no cooking equipment, not even the usual scatter of small items, food wrappers, cordage, broken branches, that typically marked even the most careful campsites. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance, but not in a way that suggested a hurried evacuation or natural disaster. Carter did not rush. He never did. He allowed silence to settle first, long enough for most people to feel compelled to fill it. Sandra, still introduced as Mary, sat upright, hands wrapped carefully in gauze, resting in her lap. Her posture was attentive, cooperative. She looked like someone who wanted to be understood. She began her story without prompting. She said the man appeared just after sunrise on the trail. Tall, covered from the neck down, reflective sunglasses that hid his eyes. He spoke little. When he did, his voice was calm, almost bored. She described how he forced them off the trail, deeper into the rock, toward a narrow canyon where sound disappeared. Carter listened. She said the man flipped a coin. Heads, Mary dies. Tails, Sandra. It landed heads. Sandra's voice broke at exactly the right moment when she described hearing her sister scream as she fell. She paused, wiped her eyes, then continued. She said she was chained in a cave afterward. It looked as if the site had been deliberately cleared. Search dogs brought to the area struggled to hold a scent. What little trace they picked up led toward the stream and then vanished entirely, as if the trail itself had been erased. Investigators noted the absence of expected markers. There were no signs of a fall, no blood, no torn fabric, no dropped gear. The personal locator beacon had not been activated. The satellite phone, later recovered in the reopened investigation, showed no outgoing distress calls. It was as if Evan and Caleb had simply stepped out of the world. For Thomas Holt, the waiting was unbearable. He replayed the last message over and over, searching for meaning where none had been intended. For Caleb's sister, Mara Rourke, the silence felt heavier than any confirmation of death. She would later say that not knowing was worse than grief, because grief at least had an object. Among the search teams, frustration grew quietly. Experienced rangers understood that accidents left patterns, that the man returned occasionally with food, that she tried to escape repeatedly, that her hands were destroyed clawing at stone. Carter nodded, occasionally asking for clarification. Locations, distances, time. Sandra answered smoothly, too smoothly. Her narrative unfolded in clean sequence. No loops, no missing hours, no confusion about order. Trauma victims often spoke in fragments, jumping between moments, trapped in sensory recall. Sandra spoke like someone reciting a timeline. Still, the details were vivid enough to convince. Within a week, the story reached local media. Headlines described a miracle survivor, a woman who had endured unspeakable cruelty in the Superstition Mountains and lived to tell it. Cable news anchors spoke solemnly about the dangers of solo hiking. Commentators invoked the old legends again, the cursed gold, the angry spirits, the mountain that never gave back what it took. Sandra watched the coverage from her hospital bed. Visitors noted her composure. She thanked nurses by name. Even in catastrophic scenarios, the mountains gave something back. A pack, a boot, a broken piece of equipment lodged in a crevice. This time, there was nothing. By the end of the first week, the search radius expanded. Helicopters scanned ridgelines, crews descended into adjacent valleys. Every potential route was examined, and still, there was no answer to the simplest question of all. If Evan Holt and Caleb Rourke were alive after September 12, why had they left no trace of that fact? And if they were dead, why had the mountains remained so completely silent? The search began with urgency, but without panic, the way professionals are trained to respond when experience tells them that most overdue hikers are eventually found alive. On the morning of September 17, 2018, a command post was established near the Molas Pass trailhead. Maps were spread across folding tables. Weather data was reviewed. Routes were assigned. She asked doctors intelligent questions about recovery timelines. She cried during interviews, but never too long, never too hard, always within expectation. A fundraiser appeared online before the second week ended. It was organized by distant relatives and friends of the family, framed as support for Mary's recovery and in memory of Sandra. Donations poured in. By the end of the month, the fund exceeded $500,000. Sandra expressed gratitude publicly. Privately, she asked when she would be discharged. Meanwhile, Carter and the search teams moved into the mountains. The cave Sandra described was located in LaBarge Canyon after 2 days of grid searching. At first glance, it appeared convincing. Narrow entrance, low ceiling, hard stone floor, a place where someone could disappear But inside, the illusion faltered. His sleeping bag was clean, too clean, no dirt ground into the fabric. The assumption, at least initially, was that Evan Holt and Caleb Rourke had encountered a navigational problem or a minor injury that had slowed their progress. That assumption did not survive the first 48 hours. Ground teams reached the base and identified in Evan's final footage by mid-afternoon on the first day. They expected to find something, an abandoned camp, a damaged tent, even a misjudged river crossing. What they found instead was an absence so complete it unsettled even veteran rangers. The terrain bore no scars of haste, no crushed vegetation suggested a scramble, no drag marks indicated an injured person being moved. The stream banks were intact. The soil around the campsite showed disturbance, but not disorder. It looked deliberate. As the search expanded, so did the questions. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the surrounding ridgelines at dawn and dusk. Nothing registered. Dogs trained to track human scent worked the stream corridor, then the slopes above it. Each time, the trail dissolved into nothing. Food packaging was stacked neatly against one wall, high-end organic brands not commonly associated with desperation. Bottled water, unopened, arranged by size. There were no chains embedded in the rock. No abrasion marks where metal would have scraped stone repeatedly. The cave felt lived in, but not imprisoned. Forensic teams collected everything. Among the items was a Walmart receipt, folded carefully and placed inside an empty food container. The date was October 12th, 2 days before the hike. The name printed on the receipt was clear: Sandra Wilson. Carter reviewed the evidence in silence. He replayed the interview audio again that night, focusing not on what Sandra said, but on what she never said. She never asked if her sister's body had been found, never asked where investigators were searching, never asked how long she had been missing. Grief, Carter knew, was rarely that tidy, public belief hardened quickly. People wanted a monster. They wanted a masked man, a nameless predator hiding in the rocks. The handlers would later describe it as if the scent had simply stopped existing. By day 3, the operation had escalated. Over 60 personnel were involved, including county search and rescue units, Forest Service rangers, and volunteers with alpine experience. A 15-mile radius was methodically divided into grids. Side valleys were descended. Rock overhangs were inspected. Narrow slots between cliff faces were probed with cameras. Still, nothing surfaced. The first tangible discovery came late on the 4th day. A ranger team located Evan and Caleb's vehicle, a gray Ford pickup, parked on an unmaintained service road approximately 3 miles from the official trailhead. The location immediately raised concern. The road was rarely used and did not correspond to the route outlined in their permit. The truck was locked. Inside were items that made no sense to leave behind: Evan's wallet, spare batteries, and a notebook containing handwritten shot lists for the documentary. The idea that the mountain itself could still produce evil felt familiar, comforting even. It preserved order. Danger stayed external. Sandra's story fit. But small fractures widened under scrutiny. Medical staff noted how quickly her hand wounds began to heal. Severe abrasions typically became infected in wilderness conditions. Sandra's wounds were painful but clean, as if treated repeatedly, controlled. When Carter requested dental records, the results arrived quietly. Mary Wilson's lower molar showed a titanium post from a root canal performed 3 years earlier. X-rays of the survivor's jaw showed no such implant. Her teeth were intact, healthy. When confronted gently with this inconsistency, Sandra did not react with confusion or panic. She listened. Then she smiled. By the time Carter requested her phone records, the case had already turned. GPS data showed Sandra's phone pinging near the mountain days before the hike. The keys were missing. Investigators photographed the scene carefully. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no indication that anyone else had accessed the vehicle. The tires showed no recent disturbance beyond the original parking. If Evan and Caleb had returned to the truck, they had not stayed long. If someone else had moved it, they had done so without leaving a trace. The discovery shifted the tone of the search. What had initially been framed as a potential survival situation now began to resemble something far less straightforward. If the men had been injured deep in the backcountry, why abandon essential items? If they had chosen to exit early, why leave behind identification and supplies? And if they had encountered danger, why was there no evidence of struggle, either at the campsite or near the vehicle? By the end of the first week, the probability curves changed. Surveillance footage from Walmart confirmed the purchase of rope, duct tape, bottled water, and camouflage clothing. The final piece came from fingerprints, under layers of tape recovered from the cave floor. Tape Sandra claimed had bound her wrists. Technicians found clear prints, not smeared, pressed deliberately. They belonged to Sandra Wilson. The arrest took place at the Wilson family home in Paradise Valley. Sandra answered the door herself. She appeared calm, alert, almost expectant. During interrogation, after her rights were read, she offered no denial, no tears, no anger. She leaned back in her chair and spoke evenly. She never knew how lucky she was, Sandra said. I just finished what the mountains started. When asked if she regretted killing her sister, Sandra shook her head. I didn't kill her, she said. I replaced her. In the weeks that followed, the public struggled to recalibrate. Comment sections filled with disbelief. Talk shows debated nature versus nurture. Some blamed mental illness, others blamed the mountain. Search coordinators acknowledged privately what they would not yet say publicly: the lack of physical evidence was no longer encouraging. It was alarming. Families were briefed daily. Thomas Holt attended each update in person, standing silently at the edge of the command area, absorbing details that offered no clarity. Mara Rourke asked questions the investigators could not answer. Had any footprints been found? Had any personal items surfaced? Could animals have removed all traces? The answers were always the same. No, unlikely. As days turned into weeks, the search pressed into increasingly dangerous terrain. Crews rappelled into narrow chasms where a fall would have been fatal. Old mining shafts, long abandoned, were checked despite the risk of collapse. Every effort was logged. Every negative result was documented. By October 2nd, nearly 3 weeks after the disappearance, officials made the decision to scale back active searching. The announcement was careful, almost apologetic. Resources were limited. Weather windows were closing. A few questioned how many times Sandra had been seen without truly being seen. The fundraiser was frozen. The donations rerouted. Mary Wilson was buried without a body. Sandra Wilson was transferred to county jail to await trial. At night, guards reported hearing voices from her cell. 2 tones. One softer, one sharp, often arguing. Sometimes laughing. Sandra spent long periods standing before the mirror bolted to the wall, practicing. The case should have felt finished. The evidence was clean. The narrative, once reversed, made sense. A jealous sister, a planned disappearance, a staged survival. In most investigations, that would have been enough. Charges filed, trials scheduled, public attention redirected to the next horror. But Detective Lance Carter could not shake the feeling that something essential was still unresolved. It began with timing. Sandra Wilson had not simply survived. She had returned at the precise moment when her story would carry maximum impact, not too soon to invite skepticism. Snow was beginning to dust the higher elevations. Continuing at full scale would put rescuers at unacceptable risk. The case was not closed, they emphasized. It was suspended. In his final report, the incident commander outlined the most plausible scenario given the available data. He cited the possibility of an unobserved fall into inaccessible terrain, compounded by environmental factors that could have concealed remains. It was the standard language used when nothing fit, but something had to be written. No bodies were recovered. No cause of death could be established. In March of 2020, after 18 months without new leads, a Colorado judge issued formal death declarations for Evan Holt and Caleb Rourke. The ruling was administrative, not investigative. It allowed families to settle estates, access insurance, and begin the legal process of mourning. But among those who had searched the San Juan Mountains that fall, the case never sat comfortably. They had seen accidents before. Not too late to risk death. 3 weeks. Long enough to suggest endurance, short enough to preserve control. Carter reviewed the hospital footage again. He slowed the playback, watched her interactions frame by frame. Sandra responded to pain appropriately, but never reflexively. She anticipated questions before they were asked. Her fear arrived on cue, then receded. Trauma, Carter knew, rarely behaved on schedule. In subsequent interviews, Sandra never asked follow-up questions, never sought details about the investigation unless prompted. When Carter mentioned evidence contradicting her account, she listened with interest, not alarm, as if observing an experiment rather than defending her life. Psychological evaluators would later call this detachment. Carter called it authorship. He returned to the cave a second time, alone, without the press, without technicians, without the weight of first impressions. Stripped of expectation, the space felt different. The cave was not a prison. They had recovered remains from places that seemed impossible to reach. Even the most violent natural events left traces. Something always remained. A fragment, a pattern, a final indication of what had gone wrong. This time, the mountains had given nothing. For 6 years, Evan Holt and Caleb Rourke existed only in records and memory. Their disappearance was categorized, archived, and slowly absorbed into the long history of wilderness losses that defied neat explanation. Officially, they were victims of the land they had chosen to enter. Unofficially, the question persisted, unspoken but unresolved. How could 2 men vanish so completely without leaving behind a single piece of themselves? The declaration came quietly, without ceremony, nearly 18 months after the last search team had descended from the San Juan Mountains. On March 3, 2020, a district court in La Plata County issued formal death certificates for Evan Holt and Caleb Rourke. It was organized. The sleeping area was positioned to avoid drafts. Supplies were stored above ground level to prevent moisture. The entrance allowed enough light to track time without revealing the interior from a distance. This was not where someone waited to die. This was where someone worked. Carter imagined Sandra inside the cave, rehearsing lines, adjusting expressions, practicing pain. He imagined her hands pressed against stone, not in panic, but in calculation. He noted the absence of blood spray on the walls, the lack of desperate markings common in genuine captivity. He pictured her stepping back to assess the damage. Too clean. Do it again. Back in the evidence room, Carter reviewed items recovered from Sandra's apartment. Mirrors, recording devices, notebooks filled with handwriting drills, printed photographs of Mary taken from social media, marked with notes, posture, tone, clothing. Sandra had not wanted Mary's life. She had wanted Mary's presence. The ruling cited death by misadventure in wilderness terrain, a classification broad enough to close the file without answering any of the questions that had led to it. For the legal system, the decision was procedural. For the families, it was a second loss. Thomas Holt sat in the back of the courtroom as the judge read the order aloud. He did not look up when Evan's name was spoken. Later, he would say that the word dead felt abstract in that moment, like a placeholder rather than a conclusion. Without a body, without a location, without even a final object to mark the end of his son's life, the declaration felt less like closure and more like an administrative necessity imposed by time. The consequences were immediate and practical. Insurance claims that had been frozen since 2018 were finally processed. Evan's equipment, most of it never recovered, was written off as lost. His unfinished documentary project was formally archived by the small production cooperative he had worked with, labeled incomplete due to circumstances beyond control. At the detention facility, guards began documenting irregular behavior. Sandra requested access to a mirror beyond what policy allowed. When denied, she improvised, using reflective surfaces, polished metal, glass, even the surface of water in her cup. She practiced facial expressions repeatedly, cycling through them until one settled. Staff reported hearing her speak aloud at night, sometimes softly, sometimes sharply. The voices were similar but not identical. One night, a guard paused outside her cell and listened. "You hesitate there," one voice said. "I didn't want it to sound forced," the other replied. In court filings, Carter described Sandra not as delusional but as deliberate, not dissociated but divided. Her identity had not fractured accidentally. It had been replaced methodically. Mary Wilson, in this context, became less a victim of murder than a vessel. The public struggled with that interpretation. It was easier to believe in madness than intention. Caleb's federal contracts were terminated posthumously. His research notes, last synced months before the trip, were released to colleagues with an asterisk noting that his final field observations would never be known. The families responded differently. Thomas Holt used part of the insurance payout to establish a small grant fund for independent environmental filmmakers, a quiet tribute that carried Evan's name without drawing attention. He declined interviews. He refused invitations to speak at outdoor safety panels. When asked why, he gave the same answer every time: there was nothing new to say. Mara Rourke, by contrast, struggled against the finality of the ruling. She requested copies of every search log, every ranger report, every piece of correspondence related to her brother's disappearance. She read them obsessively, searching for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that suggested a missed lead. Easier to blame the mountain, the myths, the dark history of superstition. Easier to imagine a sudden break than a slow construction. During the preliminary hearing, Sandra remained composed. She corrected the pronunciation of her name when the clerk misspoke. She adjusted her posture when cameras shifted angle. She smiled faintly when reporters gasped. Carter watched from the gallery. He realized then that Sandra was not finished performing. The trial would give her what she wanted most: witnesses. Expert testimony outlined her psychological profile: obsessive fixation, identity appropriation, extreme self-harm framed as transformation. The analogies varied: parasite, mimic, shadow, but the conclusion remained consistent. Sandra did not want to destroy Mary. She wanted to erase the boundary between them. During a recess, Sandra caught her reflection in the courtroom glass. She tilted her head slightly, the way Mary used to when listening. Satisfied, she looked away. She fixated on the abandoned campsite, on the vehicle parked where it should not have been, on the complete absence of physical evidence. "To be dead," she wrote in a letter to the sheriff's office. "You have to leave something behind." There was no response. As the years passed, the case receded from public awareness. The San Juan Mountains continued to claim victims, as mountains always do. Climbers fell. Hikers underestimated weather. Bodies were recovered, names added to lists. Each new incident reinforced the narrative that Evan and Caleb had simply been absorbed into the statistics of wilderness risk. Online, the story lived on in fragments. A handful of forum threads resurfaced every few months, often sparked by newcomers stumbling across old news articles. Theories circulated briefly and then dissolved. Some suggested a navigational error so catastrophic it erased all trace. Others proposed a deliberate disappearance, though no motive was ever articulated. Carter returned to the mountain one last time before the trial began. He stood on Route 88, at dusk, watching the light fade from the rock. The Superstition Mountains loomed unchanged, silent, indifferent. They had not created Sandra. They had merely provided cover. The danger, Carter concluded, had never been the wilderness. It was the quiet certainty of someone who believed they deserved another person's life and was willing to dismantle themselves piece by piece to claim it. When the verdict came months later, it would be decisive, but resolution would remain elusive, because somewhere between the cave and the courtroom, between imitation and embodiment, Sandra Wilson had crossed a line that could not be neatly labeled, and Carter knew, with an unease that lingered long after the case closed, that if she had not been stopped when she was, the next disappearance would not have looked like a crime at all. It would have looked like continuity. The final collapse did not arrive as a revelation. A few hinted at darker explanations, illegal activity, hidden enclaves, things best left unnamed, but these posts were usually dismissed and quietly deleted. Among professionals, the case remained an anomaly. Rangers who had participated in the original search occasionally revisited it in private conversations, usually late at night, after long shifts. They spoke in hypotheticals, careful not to cross into speculation. What if the men had encountered someone? What if the campsite had been cleared intentionally? What if the lack of evidence was itself the evidence? None of these questions appeared in official records. By 2023, the file labeled Holt Evan, Rourke, Caleb had been moved to long-term storage. Digital records were preserved. Physical documents were boxed and shelved. The mountains had reclaimed the ground where the men were last seen. Vegetation grew back. Seasonal floods rearranged stream beds. Whatever trace had once existed was now gone, or so it seemed. In the eyes of the law, the story was over. 2 men entered the wilderness. They did not return. Time passed. It arrived as accumulation, frame by frame, receipt by receipt. The illusion unraveled not through drama, but through arithmetic. The Walmart footage was the first to be shown in full, recorded on October 12th, 2 days before the hike. The video followed Sandra Wilson through the outdoor aisle with clinical clarity. She moved without haste, scanning shelves, reading labels, comparing options. There was no visible distress, no hesitation. She selected rope with a breaking strength rated far beyond climbing needs. Duct tape, bottled water in bulk, protein bars marketed for endurance athletes, a camouflage jacket sized for Mary's frame, not her own. At the register, Sandra paid in cash. She did not look at the camera. Investigators noted the absence of urgency. People preparing to flee often rushed. Sandra did not. She behaved like someone executing a checklist. Carter paused the footage repeatedly, isolating gestures, the way Sandra adjusted the jacket on her arm, testing the weight. The system did what it was designed to do when answers failed to materialize. It closed the book. No one anticipated that the story would be reopened. Not by new evidence, not by a recovered body, but by a man stepping out of the trees 6 years later, alive, altered, and carrying with him an account that would force everyone involved to confront a possibility they had never officially considered, that Evan Holt had not died in the mountains, and that whatever had happened to him there had followed him back. Evan Holt did not wake up as a man who had been rescued. He woke as someone who had been displaced. In the intensive care unit at Mercy Regional Medical Center, the lights remained dimmed around his bed even during daylight hours. Doctors had learned quickly that sudden brightness triggered involuntary reactions. His heart rate spiked, his breathing turned shallow, and his hands clenched as if bracing for impact. The moment she glanced at her reflection in the freezer door and subtly corrected her posture, she was already rehearsing. The receipts corroborated the timeline. The GPS data placed Sandra near LaBarge Canyon multiple times in the days before the hike. She had visited the cave alone. She had prepared it. His was not opportunistic violence.br. T was premeditated replacement.br. Psychiatric evaluations followed. R. Helen Moore, a forensic psychologist with experience in identity disorders. reviewed Sandra's journals, recordings, and digital footprint. Her conclusion avoided sensational language. Andra did not exhibit hallucinations. She was not detached from reality. She understood consequences. She understood morality. He rejected it, Andra's fixation on Mary did not stem from a desire for affection or approval. It stemmed from entitlement. She viewed Mary's life not as separate, but misallocated. She didn't want to become Mary, Moore testified. She believed she already was, just delayed. Nurses approached slowly, announcing themselves before entering his line of sight. Doors were left partially open whenever possible. From a medical standpoint, Evan's condition was alarming but survivable. He was severely underweight, having lost more than 40% of his estimated body mass. Blood tests showed prolonged malnutrition, electrolyte imbalance, and evidence of repeated exposure to extreme stress. Old fractures were visible in X-rays, at least 2 ribs, a wrist, and what appeared to be a healed compression fracture in the lower spine. None of the injuries were recent. All had healed without proper medical care. The scars concerned the doctors more. Across Evan's chest and upper arms were pattern marks that did not align with accidental injury. Some appeared to be burn scars, circular and evenly spaced. Others were thin, linear cuts, deliberately placed, layered over one another in ways that suggested repetition over time. A dermatologist consulted on the case described them as intentional, non-random, and inconsistent with known environmental causes. When Evan noticed the examination, he turned his head away and whispered a single word, "Don't." Psychiatrists were brought in within the first 24 hours. Their initial assessments were cautious. Evan exhibited symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, dissociation, and profound anxiety triggered by confinement. He startled violently at footsteps in the hallway. He refused to sleep unless the bed was positioned so he could see the door. When asked where he had been for the past 6 years, Evan did not answer. When asked how he survived, he closed his eyes. Law enforcement maintained a presence just outside the unit, careful not to overwhelm him. The sheriff's office coordinated with federal authorities, reopening the case under strict confidentiality protocols. The decision was made early to limit media exposure. Hospital staff were instructed not to speak to reporters. Security was increased. This distinction mattered. Sandra's self-harm, detailed extensively in medical reports, was not impulsive. Each injury followed a pattern. Controlled depth, repeated abrasion, strategic damage designed to look chaotic while preserving function. She injured herself the way an artist modifies a medium. Forensic pathologists reconstructed the wounds in sequence. The earliest abrasions were shallow, exploratory. Later injuries were deeper, time to reopen healing tissue. The removal of fingernails was staggered, not simultaneous, allowing pain to remain constant without becoming incapacitating. Sandra did not seek numbness. She sought continuity of suffering. In court, the dental evidence carried quiet finality. Mary Wilson's medical records were introduced. X-rays from 3 years prior displayed a titanium post embedded in the lower left molar. The implant was visible even to the untrained eye. The X-rays of the survivor showed nothing. Even so, rumors began circulating within hours. A man declared dead had returned. Thomas Holt arrived at the hospital the following afternoon. He stood at the foot of Evan's bed for a long time without speaking. Later, he would say that his first overwhelming emotion was not relief, but fear. The person lying in front of him looked like his son but moved like someone else entirely. When Thomas finally spoke Evan's name, Evan's eyes opened, but there was no recognition. It took several seconds before he whispered, "You're real." That moment, according to clinicians present, marked the beginning of Evan's gradual reorientation to the present. It did not bring clarity. It brought confusion. News of Evan's return leaked despite official efforts. By the second day, social media was flooded with speculation. Old photographs were reposted. Headlines questioned the plausibility of survival. Sandra watched the images without expression. When asked to explain the discrepancy, she did not argue. She did not claim error. She simply said, "I never needed one." The fingerprint analysis followed. Technicians explained how latent prints were recovered from beneath layers of tape found in the cave. Not smeared, not partial. Clear impressions placed deliberately, fingers pressed flat. Sandra's fingerprints. They were positioned where restraints would have been applied, suggesting control, not captivity. The implications settled heavily over the courtroom. Sandra had not been bound. She had staged the binding. The prosecution laid out the final sequence. Sandra led Mary into the Superstition Mountains under the guise of reconciliation. She chose terrain that limited witnesses and facilitated concealment. She killed Mary, likely quickly, likely without warning. The body was never recovered, but soil disturbances near the canyon suggested burial or removal into inaccessible terrain. Commentators debated whether the disappearance had been staged, whether the scars were self-inflicted, whether the story would unravel under scrutiny. Investigators were aware of these narratives, but their focus remained narrow and methodical. They reviewed Evan's medical findings alongside the original search data. They noted consistencies that could not be easily dismissed: the timing of his reappearance, his physical condition, the lack of modern materials on his clothing. The animal hide he wore when found was sent to a lab. Initial analysis suggested it had been tanned using primitive methods, not commercially processed. Still, none of this explained where he had been. Evan spoke only in fragments during the first week. He asked repeatedly if the walls were concrete or stone. He refused to enter enclosed imaging machines until doctors agreed to leave the door visible. When a nurse attempted to close the blinds one evening, Evan shouted, a sharp, panicked sound that startled the entire floor. He did not ask about Caleb. That omission did not go unnoticed. Detectives waited. Sandra then assumed Mary's identity, entering a controlled period of isolation designed to produce physical evidence consistent with survival and trauma. She inflicted wounds over time, rationed supplies, rehearsed her story, and emerged at a moment optimized for discovery. Every step was intentional. The defense attempted to frame Sandra as mentally ill beyond accountability. The argument failed. Mental illness, the court concluded, did not explain preparation, patience, and precision. During testimony, Sandra spoke only once. She requested permission to address the court. Her voice was steady. I loved my sister, she said, more than anyone ever did. I knew her better than anyone. I still do. She paused, as if expecting agreement. I didn't steal her life, Sandra continued. I corrected it. The courtroom remained silent. The verdict, when delivered, was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing followed weeks later. Life imprisonment without parole. Sandra did not react. They had learned from experience that trauma survivors often required time before coherent narratives emerged. Pressing too hard, too soon risked contamination of memory, or worse, complete withdrawal. Instead, they documented Evan's spontaneous remarks, however disjointed. On the fifth night, as rain tapped against the hospital windows, Evan spoke without prompting. He didn't scream, he said. No one responded immediately. After a long pause, Evan added, "That's how they knew it worked." The attending psychiatrist noted the statement carefully and did not ask him to elaborate.
By the end of the second week, Evan was deemed medically stable enough to be moved out of intensive care.
A secure rehabilitation plan was developed, combining physical therapy with controlled psychological support. Law enforcement prepared to take a formal statement, but only after clearance from medical professionals. Outside the hospital, the San Juan Mountains stood unchanged. Snow dusted the higher elevations. As she was led from the room, she glanced once toward the gallery, scanning faces. Not for family, not for sympathy, but for recognition. In the aftermath, public debate lingered. Commentators argued whether Sandra was a monster or a mirror. Some questioned how many times people performed versions of themselves unnoticed. Others returned to the Superstition Mountains, insisting the land itself corrupted those who entered. Carter rejected both extremes. The mountain had not whispered instructions. Sandra had listened only to herself. Months later, at the correctional facility, guards continued to report unusual behavior. Sandra requested access to writing materials and mirrors. When denied, she adapted. She practiced in reflective surfaces. She spoke aloud in two tones, one calm, one critical. Therapists noted that Sandra did not mourn Mary. She referenced her frequently, but never in the past tense. Mary remained present, as standard, as benchmark. Trails closed for the season. The land that had swallowed 2 men 6 years earlier gave no indication that it was about to be questioned again. Inside, Evan Holt slept in short intervals, waking often, his body free from captivity, but his mind still trapped somewhere beyond reach. He had returned, but the story of where he had been and what had happened to Caleb Rourke had yet to be told. When Evan Holt finally agreed to speak in a formal setting, it was not in an interrogation room. At the recommendation of hospital psychiatrists, the interview took place in a small rehabilitation office on the 3rd floor, its windows facing the mountains. The blinds were kept open. The door remained unlocked. 2 detectives from the San Juan County Sheriff's Office were present, along with a clinical psychologist who had spent the previous 2 weeks establishing a fragile sense of trust with Evan. The session was recorded, but only audio. Evan refused the camera. In one recorded session, Sandra was asked who she believed she was now. She answered without hesitation. "Me," she said. Finally, the Superstition Mountains remained unchanged. Tourists continued to hike. Legends persisted. The road claimed its share of accidents and disappearances, but Carter knew the truth of this case would never fully settle, because it was not about where the crime happened. It was about how easily a person could be studied, rehearsed, dismantled, and replaced, and how long it took for anyone to notice. The arrest did not feel like an ending. It felt administrative. Sandra Wilson was taken into custody on a quiet afternoon in Paradise Valley, the neighborhood unchanged by the gravity of what had unfolded behind one of its manicured doors. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as police vehicles idled at the curb. There were no raised voices, no resistance. Sandra walked between deputies with measured steps, her posture straight, her expression neutral. At the beginning, he struggled to orient himself in time. Dates meant little to him. He spoke instead in sequences, before and after, light and dark, quiet and noise. The psychologist guided him gently, grounding each statement without correcting or challenging it. What emerged over the next several hours was not a story told in a straight line, but a series of images, sensations, and memories that gradually began to connect. According to Evan, the day everything changed was September 13th, 2018. He and Caleb had broken camp early that morning, following the stream they had filmed the night before. The plan was simple: trace the water source further east, document the terrain, then begin looping back toward their intended exit route. The weather was clear, visibility was excellent. There was no sense of urgency. They were walking single file along a narrow section of the basin when Evan heard a sound he did not immediately recognize as human. It was sharp, brief, and echoed strangely against the rock walls. She looked like someone leaving for an appointment. Inside the Wilson home, investigators cataloged what remained. Mary's belongings sat untouched in their usual places. Shoes aligned, books marked with notes, a laptop still logged into work accounts. Nothing had been disturbed, nothing stolen. Sandra had not wanted Mary's things. She had wanted the continuation. Mary Wilson was buried weeks later without a body. The service was small, closed casket. A photograph on the altar showed Mary smiling in profile, unaware of how closely that image had been studied, copied, rehearsed. Her parents sat in the front row, hands folded, unmoving. They did not cry when the minister spoke. Tears had already been spent during the weeks of uncertainty, hope, and reversal. Their grief carried a second weight. They had embraced the person who killed their daughter. They had held her hands in a hospital room. They had thanked her for surviving. That knowledge did not fade with time. It calcified. He described it as a call that wasn't meant to carry. Caleb was ahead of him. Evan said he saw Caleb turn, confusion crossing his face just before something moved out of the trees. He could not describe it clearly at first. Not a single person, but several. Their movements were fast and coordinated. They did not shout. They did not speak. Hands closed around Caleb's arms and shoulders, pulling him backward into the brush with a speed that left no time to react. Evan ran toward them. That was when the second group emerged behind him. He remembered being tackled from the side, driven hard into the ground. His face struck rock. The air left his lungs in a soundless rush. Something rough pressed against his mouth. His hands were forced behind his back and bound with cord that cut into his wrists. He said there were no words spoken, only short, controlled noises, clicks, and whistles, like signals passed between hunters. They blindfolded him. In interviews afterward, they struggled to find language that fit. There was no precedent for mourning a child while simultaneously grieving the illusion of another. Sandra had not just taken Mary's life, she had occupied her absence. Detective Lance Carter attended the sentencing quietly, seated in the back of the courtroom. He watched Sandra as the judge read the verdict. Life imprisonment without parole. No mitigation. Sandra did not react. When asked if she had anything to say, she stood slowly. The room stilled. This was never about hate, she said evenly. It was about correction. She sat back down before anyone could interrupt. The judge's gavel struck wood. The sound echoed longer than expected. In the months that followed, public interest faded, as it always did. New cases replaced old ones. Headlines moved on. The fundraiser associated with Mary's recovery was dissolved. The remaining money redirected to victim support organizations. The march that followed lasted hours, though Evan admitted he had no reliable sense of time. He stumbled often. Each time he fell, someone hauled him upright without hesitation. There was no anger in the movements, no visible emotion. The people holding him behaved with practiced efficiency, as if this was not their first time. When the blindfold was finally removed, they were no longer in open terrain. They were inside a cavern. Evan described the space in careful detail, pausing often as if checking the accuracy of his memory. The entrance, he said, was hidden high along a rock face, impossible to see from below. The interior was not a single chamber but a network. Natural tunnels widened and shaped over time, reinforced with stone and timber. Smoke stains marked the ceiling. Animal bones lined the walls, arranged deliberately rather than discarded. There were others inside. Men and women of varying ages moved through the space without acknowledging Evan directly. The Superstition Mountains returned to travel brochures and hiking blogs, their darker associations softened by distance. But some questions refused to settle. Mental health professionals debated whether Sandra represented an extreme outlier or a warning sign overlooked. Commentators asked how often people rehearsed versions of themselves unseen, unchallenged, how identity could be mimicked so thoroughly that even those closest failed to detect the substitution. Carter returned to Route 88 one last time before transferring units. He stood at the roadside where the truck driver had stopped, where headlights had carved a human shape out of darkness. The mountain rose in silhouette, unchanged, indifferent. It had not whispered instructions. It had not demanded sacrifice. It had simply been there. Sandra Wilson entered the state correctional facility, quietly. Guards noted her compliance. She followed routines precisely. She asked for reading materials, writing utensils, access to educational programs. Their clothing was made from layered animal hides, stitched crudely but effectively. Hair was worn long, braided tightly against the scalp, often decorated with bone fragments or feathers. Many had markings on their skin, dark, angular symbols cut or burned into flesh. They took Evan and Caleb to separate areas. Evan did not see Caleb again that day. Over the following days, how many, Evan could not say, he was kept alone in a narrow chamber with no natural light. Food was given irregularly, dried meat, bitter roots, water that tasted of minerals. He was not beaten. He was not spoken to. He was watched. Eventually, he was brought before someone the others deferred to. Evan referred to him as the witness. He described the witness as an older man, his body marked with scars that overlapped and crossed one another in layers that suggested decades of ritual injury. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, his eyes unsettlingly clear. When the witness entered a space, Evan said, others lowered their gaze. No one contradicted him. She adapted quickly, learning the rhythms of confinement with the same discipline she had applied to imitation. She requested a mirror. When denied, she found others, metal fixtures, polished surfaces, still water. She spent long periods standing motionless, studying her reflection, adjusting posture, relaxing her shoulders, practicing expressions without speaking. When she did speak, it was often in two tones, one instructive, one responsive. Therapists recorded these behaviors without comment. In one session, a clinician asked Sandra who she believed she was now. Sandra tilted her head slightly, the way Mary used to when considering a question. "I'm finished," she said. "That's who I am at night." Correctional officers reported hearing low conversations from her cell. Sometimes they sounded like arguments, sometimes like rehearsals, sometimes like laughter, always controlled. Outside the prison walls, Mary Wilson's name slowly receded from public memory. Her company continued under new leadership. No one spoke unless addressed. The witness did speak, but not in English. Evan could not recall the language clearly. He said it was structured, rhythmic, and often accompanied by gestures toward the stone walls or the ceiling above them. The psychologist later noted that Evan did not frame this as mystical or supernatural. He described it as functional, as if meaning was embedded in repetition rather than vocabulary. Through observation alone, Evan began to understand the group's belief system. They believed the mountains were not land but body. They believed intrusion, mapping, filming, measuring was a form of injury. Outsiders were not killed immediately, Evan said, because death resolved nothing. Suffering, in their view, was a necessary correction. Caleb resisted. Evan's voice changed when he spoke about that period. His sentences shortened. His breathing became shallow. He said Caleb shouted during the first attempt to bind him for a ritual he did not yet understand. Her digital presence remained. Archived interviews, photographs, articles, unchanging, frozen at the moment before her life was taken. Sandra accessed none of it. She no longer needed reference material. The Superstition Mountains endured. Tourists still hiked the trails. Legends still circulated. Some claimed the land punished greed. Others said it swallowed the unprepared. A few insisted the mountains revealed what people already were. Carter never fully decided which explanation troubled him more, because this case had not been about wilderness or myth or madness. It had been about proximity, about how closely one person could observe another, how patiently they could rehearse, how convincingly they could step into a life already mapped, and how long it took for anyone to notice that something essential was missing. On certain nights, when the desert wind moved just right through the canyons, drivers on Route 88 reported feeling watched, not threatened, just observed, as if something unseen was measuring them. The sound carried through the caverns. That was when Evan realized something fundamental. The group did not fear being heard. They believed they were beyond discovery. At this point in the interview, Evan stopped speaking. His hands trembled. The psychologist ended the session. In the official transcript, the detectives noted the consistency of Evan's descriptions with unexplained elements from the original search, the cleared campsite, the absence of equipment, the lack of scent trails. They also noted the obvious gaps: no coordinates, no names, no physical markers that could be independently verified. Still, as one investigator later wrote in a private memo, the account was too structured to dismiss and too disturbing to accept without proof. Evan Holt had begun to describe what he said happened beneath the San Juan Mountains. But the most critical part of his account, the fate of Caleb Rourke, remained untold. Evan Holt did not describe Caleb Rourke's death all at once, not to take their lives, but to learn them. When the interview resumed 2 days later, the psychologist noted a marked change in Evan's demeanor. He was quieter, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed not on the detectives, but on the window beyond them, where the mountains cut a sharp line against the sky. He asked twice whether the door was still unlocked. Only after receiving confirmation did he begin to speak. According to Evan, the group waited before acting. For what he believed were several days after their capture, Caleb was kept restrained but alive, held in a larger chamber closer to the center of the cave system. Evan caught glimpses of him only briefly, usually when he was being moved between spaces. Caleb looked thinner, his face bruised, his hands bound, but he was still conscious, still defiant. Evan said Caleb tried to communicate with him once, shouting his name when they passed each other in a corridor. The response was immediate. Several members of the group descended on Caleb, forcing him to the ground. No blows were struck. Instead, they pressed his face against the stone floor until he stopped shouting. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Evan understood then that resistance did not provoke rage. It triggered procedure. The ritual took place after what Evan estimated to be 2 weeks of captivity, though he admitted his sense of time was unreliable. He was awakened in the middle of what passed for night in the caverns, an artificial darkness maintained by extinguishing all fire sources at once. Hands seized him. He was dragged through tunnels he did not recognize, his feet scraping against rock. They brought him into a vast chamber. This space, Evan said, was different from the others. The ceiling rose higher, disappearing into darkness. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of burned minerals. In the center of the chamber was a pit, ringed with stones blackened by repeated exposure to fire. Symbols were carved into the surrounding walls, angular repetitive shapes layered atop older markings. Caleb was already there. He was bound upright to a wooden frame positioned above the pit. His clothes had been removed. His skin was marked with cuts and burns similar to Evan's, but fresher. His face was swollen. When he saw Evan, his expression shifted, not to fear, but to something closer to resignation. Evan said that was the moment he realized the ritual was not punishment. It was instruction. The members of the group gathered in silence around the pit. No one restrained Evan. He was positioned deliberately, given a clear view. The witness stood apart from the others, his body illuminated by firelight. He spoke at length in the same rhythmic language Evan had heard before, gesturing first to the stone walls, then upward, then finally toward Caleb. As the fire was lit, Evan said Caleb began to struggle. His voice echoed violently through the chamber as he shouted, first Evan's name, then words Evan could not hear clearly over the roar of the flames. Several members stepped forward, tightening the bindings. There was no attempt to quiet him beyond that. His resistance was allowed. Evan was not. When he tried to look away, hands forced his head forward. What followed was not swift. Evan's description of the event was fragmented, punctuated by long silences. He spoke of heat rising from the pit, of the smell of burning wood and flesh mingling until they became indistinguishable. He spoke of Caleb's voice changing as smoke filled his lungs, of the moment when shouting turned to choking gasps. He did not describe the end. He did not need to. After the fire was extinguished, the group waited. When the pit cooled, they removed what remained of Caleb's body. Evan said he expected desecration. Instead, the remains were handled with care. Bones were cleaned, ash was collected. Everything was placed into a stone recess carved into the far wall of the chamber. Then, the witness turned to Evan. He spoke again, gesturing now not to the pit, but to Evan's chest. That was when Evan's treatment changed. He was no longer kept isolated. In the days that followed, Evan was brought into the communal spaces of the cave. He was made to watch daily rituals, smaller, quieter repetitions of the larger ceremony. He was marked with new scars, each inflicted slowly, deliberately. He was forced to ingest bitter liquids that blurred his vision and distorted his sense of reality. Evan said the pain was never random. Each act followed a pattern. Through observation, he came to understand their logic. Caleb's death had not been the goal. It had been a demonstration. Evan was what remained to be corrected. From that point on, he was no longer referred to as a person. He became a symbol. During the interview, the psychologist asked Evan why he believed the group allowed him to live. Evan's answer was immediate. "Because I stayed," he said. "Because I learned." The detectives ended the session shortly after. Evan was visibly shaking. Medical staff administered sedatives, and he slept for nearly 12 hours. In the official summary, investigators noted that Evan's account of the ritual was internally consistent, emotionally congruent, and aligned with the physical scars documented on his body. They also noted the absence of any independent verification. No remains had been recovered. No witnesses existed beyond Evan himself. Still, the question lingered in the margins of the report. If Evan Holt was fabricating his account, what purpose did such a story serve? And if he was not, then somewhere beneath the San Juan Mountains, a man named Caleb Rourke had died in a place no map acknowledged, witnessed only by those who believed they would never be found. After Caleb Rourke's death, time ceased to function as Evan Holt had once understood it. In his testimony, Evan struggled to place events on any conventional timeline. Days and nights blurred into a continuous cycle defined not by light or darkness, but by ritual. Fire was lit and extinguished according to rules he did not fully grasp. Food appeared and disappeared without pattern. Sleep came in short, fractured intervals, often interrupted by sounds that signaled it was time to move, to watch, or to endure. He was no longer confined to a single chamber. Instead, Evan was integrated into the life of the cave. At first, this took the form of observation. He was made to sit along the perimeter of communal spaces while the others performed daily rites, marking stone walls with ash, arranging animal bones into precise formations, tracing symbols into the dirt with sharpened sticks. No one explained the meaning. Evan was expected to learn through repetition. Gradually, observation turned into participation. They burned him first. Evan described the pain in clinical terms, detached, as if reciting facts rather than memories. Heated metal was pressed against his skin in measured intervals, always in the same locations, always following the same sequence. The wounds were allowed to blister, then heal. When scars formed, new marks were layered over them. The process was slow, deliberate, and deeply intentional. There was no shouting, no visible pleasure taken by those who inflicted the pain. The act was treated as maintenance. Cuts followed the burns. Thin blades of obsidian were used to slice shallow lines across his arms, chest, and back. The wounds were cleaned immediately afterward with mineral-rich water and herbal poultices. Infection, Evan said, was not tolerated. His body was not meant to fail. It was meant to persist. Between rituals, Evan was given liquids brewed from plants he could not identify. The taste was bitter, almost metallic. After drinking, his perception shifted. Sounds stretched. Shadows moved independently of their sources. The stone walls seemed to breathe. Over time, the boundaries between waking and dreaming dissolved. That was when his sense of self began to erode. Evan stopped thinking in sentences. Thoughts became images. Firelight on stone. The weight of bone ornaments against skin. The rhythm of footsteps echoing through tunnels. Names lost their meaning. When he tried to recall his own, it felt foreign, disconnected from the body he inhabited. The group encouraged this loss. They stopped restraining him entirely. He was free to move within the cave system, but the freedom was illusory. Every passage looked the same. Every turn led back into familiar darkness. Attempts to map the tunnels mentally failed. The layout resisted logic, twisting in ways that defied spatial memory. Evan said he learned quickly that escape was not prevented by force. It was prevented by disorientation. As months or years passed, Evan was subjected to deeper rituals. Some involved isolation in total darkness for extended periods. Others required him to stand motionless before the stone altar. hands pressed against cold rock while the witness spoke for hours in the rhythmic language Evan had come to associate with judgment. He began to understand fragments of meaning. The mountains, in their belief system, were wounded by intrusion. Measurement, documentation, extraction. These acts were violations. Outsiders were not enemies, but symptoms. Evan was taught that suffering was not punishment, but restoration. Pain, endured properly, returned balance. Evan did not resist. In his testimony, he said resistance no longer felt possible, not because of fear, but because fear itself had been stripped away. Pain became expected, silence became safety, compliance became instinct. At some point, Evan could not say when, the rituals changed again. He was brought before the altar less frequently. The markings on his body slowed. Instead, he was tasked with preparation. He learned how to tend fires without smoke escaping visible vents. He learned which herbs dulled pain and which sharpened awareness. He learned how to clean bones. This shift unsettled him more than the violence had. It suggested progression. Evans said this was when he realized the group did not intend to kill him. They intended to transform him. During this period, the world beyond the cave ceased to feel real. Memories of his father's voice, of open sky, of moving water under sunlight faded until they felt like stories he had once heard, rather than experiences he had lived. When he tried to imagine leaving, the idea produced panic, not hope. The body he inhabited bore little resemblance to the one that had entered the mountains. Muscle had hardened through labor. Scars layered over scars. His hair and beard grew unchecked. The animal hides he wore were replaced periodically, tailored to fit him more precisely over time. He began to respond to the group's signals without conscious thought. A whistle meant stop, a click meant follow, silence meant watch. In the interview room, Evan paused for a long time when asked how long this period lasted. "Long enough," he said finally, "that I stopped waiting for it to end." The psychologist reviewing his account later identified this phase as a classic example of identity dissolution under prolonged coercive control. The combination of physical trauma, hallucinogenic substances, sensory deprivation, and ritualized repetition created conditions under which the mind adapted by surrendering autonomy. To Evan, it felt simpler than that. It felt like forgetting. When asked whether he ever believed he would leave the cave, Evan shook his head. "No," he said. "I believed the mountain was all there was." The room fell silent after that. Because if Evan Holt's account was true, then the greatest violence inflicted on him during those 6 years was not physical. It was the systematic erasure of the person he had once been. The event that allowed Evan Holt to escape was not planned, not anticipated, and not interpreted as opportunity at first. It began with rain. Deep within the cave system, weather was sensed rather than seen. Moisture in the air thickened. The stone walls, usually dry and cool to the touch, began to sweat. The sound of water changed. Drips became streams. Streams became a distant, continuous roar that reverberated through the tunnels. Evan said the group noticed immediately. Movements quickened. Fires were extinguished. Certain passages were avoided. For the first time in years, the system reacted to something it did not control. The collapse happened during what Evan described as a routine task. He had been assigned to clear debris near one of the outer corridors, an area closer to the mountain's surface, where narrow cracks allowed air to circulate. He remembered the ground trembling, not violently, but with a low, rolling vibration that passed through stone and bone alike. Then came the sound, a sharp crack, followed by a sustained thunder that swallowed every other noise. Evan was thrown forward as the floor shifted beneath him. Stones rained down from above, striking his back and shoulders. Dust filled the air so completely that he could not breathe. For several seconds, perhaps longer, there was only darkness and pressure. When the movement stopped, the cave was no longer the same. One of the primary corridors had collapsed entirely, sealing off a section of the system. Shouts echoed from deeper within, but they were distorted, fragmented. Evan realized he could no longer hear the rhythmic signals he had learned to obey. The order that governed the space had fractured. He did not run. In his testimony, Evan emphasized this point repeatedly. Escape was not an immediate thought. For years, disorientation had been enforced so completely that the idea of movement without instruction felt dangerous. Instead, he waited, crouched in the dust, his body shaking from impact and adrenaline. What changed was not the environment, it was memory. As the dust settled, Evan noticed something he had not seen in a very long time: light. A thin, uneven line of it filtered through a crack in the stone where the collapse had torn open part of the corridor wall. The light was weak, filtered through layers of rock and soil, but it was unmistakable. It was not firelight. It was not reflected glow. It was daylight. Evan said the sight triggered a physical reaction so intense it nearly incapacitated him. His chest tightened. His vision blurred. He described the sensation as pain and recognition occurring simultaneously. For reasons he could not articulate, he knew then that the space beyond the crack did not belong to the cave. That knowledge broke something open. He approached the opening slowly, his movements cautious, conditioned by years of enforced restraint. The gap was narrow, jagged, barely wide enough to fit a human body. He pressed his fingers into the stone, testing it. The rock was cold, damp, unstable. Behind him, voices echoed again, closer now. Evan made a decision he later described as instinct rather than thought. He forced himself into the opening. The process was brutal. Stone tore at his skin. He became wedged twice, his chest compressed so tightly he feared suffocation. At one point, he considered retreating, not because of pursuit, but because forward movement felt impossible. But the memory of light persisted. It pulled him onward. Eventually, the space widened. Evan emerged into a narrow vertical fissure, a natural chimney carved by water over centuries. Above him, far beyond reach, was open sky. Below him, the darkness continued, but it no longer felt endless. He climbed. The ascent took hours. His hands bled. His muscles screamed in protest. Several times he slipped, barely managing to stop himself from falling back into the void below. There were no tools, no rope, only friction and desperation. When he finally reached the surface, Evan collapsed. The world above was overwhelming. The sky was too vast, the air too thin. Sounds carried in ways that felt intrusive rather than comforting. He lay on the ground for an unknown length of time, unable to move, unable to process the reality of open space. Night fell before he stood again. Evan did not attempt to return to known trails. He avoided them instinctively, driven by a belief, whether rational or not, that remaining unseen was essential to survival. Instead, he followed water downhill, moving when his body allowed, resting when it did not. The journey that followed was fragmented in his memory. He remembered drinking from streams without filtering the water. He remembered eating raw plants, roots he recognized only vaguely from earlier foraging. He remembered collapsing repeatedly, waking unsure how much time had passed. There were moments, brief, terrifying ones, when he believed he heard whistles carried on the wind. He could not say whether these were real or hallucinated. Each time he hid until the sound faded or his consciousness slipped away. Eventually the terrain changed. Trees thinned, the ground leveled, the air warmed. Evan emerged from the forest not with intention, but with exhaustion. When he stepped onto the gravel road near Molus Pass, he did not recognize it as civilization at first. He only knew that it was no longer stone. The escape had taken days, possibly weeks. Evan could not say. Time, once again, had lost its meaning. What mattered was this. For the first time since September 2018, Evan Holt was no longer beneath the mountain. But as investigators would later note, physical escape did not equate to freedom. Whatever had been done to him underground had not stayed there. The task of verifying Evan Holt's account began cautiously, with an understanding shared by everyone involved that the line between corroboration and contamination was thin. Trauma distorted memory, suggestion shaped recall. Investigators were careful not to frame their questions in ways that might create evidence rather than uncover it. Still, the decision was made to return to the mountains. Within a week of Evan's formal statement, a joint task group was assembled. It included members of the San Juan County Sheriff's Office, U.S. Forest Service investigators, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Colorado, and a geologist familiar with karst formations and high-altitude cave systems. Officially, the mission was exploratory. Unofficially, it was an attempt to answer a question that could no longer be ignored. Was there anything beneath the San Juan Mountains that should not have been there? Evan did not accompany them. He could not provide precise coordinates, only fragmented descriptions, vertical fissures, narrow chimneys, air currents that smelled of mineral water and smoke. His recollections were dismissed by some as too vague to be actionable. Others noted the caves rarely appeared on standard maps, particularly those formed by gradual erosion rather than collapse. The team began where Evan had emerged. Searchers traced the area uphill from the gravel road near Molus Pass, following drainage lines and natural fault zones. For 3 days, they found nothing beyond the expected shallow overhangs, animal dens, dead ends. Then, late on the 4th day, a ranger noticed an irregularity high along a rock face. an unnatural pattern of soot staining on stone that should have been exposed only to clean mountain air. Closer inspection revealed a narrow opening partially concealed by rockfall and vegetation. It was not visible from below. The entrance led into a steep, unstable passage that dropped sharply inward. Rappelling equipment was required to proceed safely. Inside, the temperature dropped dramatically. The air smelled faintly of ash. What the team found as they moved deeper did not resemble a typical cave. The passages widened in places, narrowed in others, not randomly but with signs of modification. Stone had been stacked to reinforce certain walls. Charred beams, aged but intact, supported low ceilings. The floor bore traces of long-term habitation, fire pits, compacted earth, and areas worn smooth by repeated foot traffic. There were no modern tools, no plastic, no metal containers, no manufactured debris of any kind. Deeper within the system, the anthropologist made the first discovery that forced the group to stop speaking altogether. Bones. They were arranged deliberately, placed within shallow recesses carved into the rock walls. Animal remains were most common: deer, elk, smaller mammals. But among them were human bones as well, at least one femur, a partial rib cage, fragments of skull. Carbon dating later suggested a range of ages. Some were decades old, others were more recent. None could be immediately identified. Further in, they found markings on the stone. The symbols matched Evan's descriptions with unsettling precision, angular shapes carved over one another, some filled with ash, others darkened by heat. In the center of the largest chamber stood a flat stone platform, its surface blackened and cracked. Soil samples taken from the area tested positive for human remains at the molecular level, consistent with exposure to extreme heat. A fire pit. No living person was found. The cave showed signs of recent abandonment. Ash was cold but not ancient. Certain pathways had been deliberately blocked with stone. Others bore signs of collapse consistent with heavy rainfall. Whatever group had once inhabited the space had left quickly, and intentionally. The final report, compiled over the next several months, was careful in its language. It confirmed the existence of an undocumented cave system. It confirmed long-term human habitation using non-industrial methods. It confirmed the presence of human remains and evidence of ritualized fire use. It did not confirm the identity of any group. It did not establish continuity between the remains and any known missing persons case. Most importantly, it did not confirm Evan Holt's story in full. But it did not disprove it either. Privately, investigators acknowledged the discomforting overlap between Evan's account and what had been found underground. Details he could not have known. The soot patterns, the stone altar, the absence of modern materials aligned too closely with the physical evidence to dismiss outright, publicly, the case was closed with restraint. Officials stated there was no evidence of an active cult operating in the region. The cave system was sealed due to safety concerns. The remains were cataloged and placed under ongoing review. No suspects were identified. No charges were filed. As for Evan Holt, the findings did little to bring him peace. When informed that the cave had been found, but no one else had been there, he did not appear surprised. He only asked whether the stone walls were still standing. When told they were, he nodded once and said nothing more. In the absence of perpetrators, responsibility diffused into silence. The mountains, as always, offered no explanation. Evan Holt did not return to a life that resembled the one he had left. In the months following the investigation's conclusion, he lived under medical supervision in a quiet residential facility outside Durango. The location was chosen deliberately, close enough to receive care, far enough from crowds and confined urban spaces. His days followed a controlled routine: therapy sessions in the morning, physical rehabilitation in the afternoon, long periods of silence in between. Progress was measured cautiously. Evan learned to tolerate closed doors again, but only if they remained unlocked. He slept in short intervals, often waking abruptly, his body rigid, his breathing shallow. Loud or sudden sounds triggered immediate distress. He avoided mirrors. When asked why, he said the person reflected there felt unfinished. Doctors diagnosed him with complex post-traumatic stress disorder compounded by dissociative symptoms consistent with prolonged captivity and coercive control. One psychiatrist described his condition as a mind that adapted perfectly to an impossible environment and now struggles to readapt to a safe one. Evan rarely spoke about the cave unless prompted. When he did, his language remained precise, stripped of embellishment. He did not frame his experiences in moral terms. He did not describe his captors as evil. He spoke of them as systems, structured, functional, absolute. This neutrality unsettled some of those who listened. It blurred the boundary between victim and witness in ways that resisted simple interpretation. Public interest in the case surged briefly and then receded. Without arrests, without names, without a clear narrative to follow, attention moved on. The sealed cave became a footnote in regional records, classified as a safety hazard. Trails near the area were quietly rerouted. Official signage made no mention of what had been found beneath the rock. Among professionals, debate persisted. Some psychologists argued that Evans' account reflected a trauma-induced reconstruction, shaped by memory fragmentation and symbolic association. They pointed to the absence of independent verification for key elements of his story. They warned against mistaking internal coherence for external truth. Others disagreed. They noted the physical evidence that aligned too closely with Evans' descriptions to be coincidental. They pointed to the deliberate clearing of the campsite in 2018, the unexplained abandonment of the vehicle, the absence of modern materials in the cave. They asked why a fractured mind would invent details that investigators later found without prompting. The question remained unresolved. Thomas Holt visited his son weekly. Their conversations were quiet, often sparse. Sometimes they spoke about the past, small memories, unremarkable moments, shared routines. Other times they sat together in silence, watching the light shift across the mountains outside the window. Caleb Rourke's remains were never identified. Without definitive proof, his family was left suspended between loss and uncertainty. Mara Rourke attended no memorials. She said she could not mourn a man who had not been found. In the end, no official conclusion satisfied everyone. Was Evan Holt the sole survivor of a hidden, isolated group that had lived undetected beneath one of America's most visited mountain ranges? Or was his story the product of a mind that had endured such extreme trauma that it constructed, meaning where none could be verified? The evidence supported neither explanation fully, and contradicted neither. What is known is this: Evan Holt disappeared into the San Juan Mountains in September of 2018. 6 years later, he emerged altered in ways that could not be explained by exposure or accident alone. Beneath the mountains, investigators found proof of long-term human presence that had gone unnoticed for decades. Whoever lived there was gone by the time they arrived. The mountains offered no answers. They stood as they always had, silent, immense, indifferent to the questions asked of them. Whatever truth lay buried within their stone remained beyond reach, sealed not only by rock, but by uncertainty. Evan Holt survived. But whether he ever truly escaped what happened beneath the San Juan Mountains is a question that, like the case itself, remains open, waiting in the dark space between what can be proven and what can only be believed.